Chapter 19 of the Alaskan. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Lars Rolander. The Alaskan by James Oliver Curwood. Chapter 19. Alan's first thought was of the monstrous incongruity of the thing, the almost physical impossibility of a mésalliance of the sort Mary Standish had revealed to him. He saw her, young and beautiful, with face and eyes that from the beginning had made him feel all that was good and sweet in life, and behind her he saw the shadow hulk of John Graham, the pitiless Iron Man, without conscience and without soul, coarsened by power, fiendish in his iniquities, and old enough to be her father. A slow smile twisted his lips, but he did not know he smiled. He pulled himself together without letting her see the physical part of the effort it was taking, and he tried to find something to say that would help clear her eyes of the agony that was in them. "That is a most unreasonable thing to be true," he said. It seemed to him his lips were making words out of wood, and that the words were fatuously inefficient compared with what he should have said or acted under the circumstances. She nodded. "It is, but the world doesn't look at it in that way. Such things just happen." She reached for a book which lay on the table where the tundra daisies were heaped. It was a book written around the early phases of pioneer life in Alaska, taken from his own library, a volume of statistical worth, dryly but carefully written, and she had been reading it. It struck him as a symbol of the fight she was making, of her courage, and of her desire to triumph in the face of tremendous odds that must have beset her. He still could not associate her completely with John Graham, yet his face was cold and white. Her hand trembled a little as she opened the book and took from it a newspaper clipping. She did not speak as she unfolded it and gave it to him. At the top of two printed columns was the picture of a young and beautiful girl. In an oval covering a small space over the girl's shoulder was a picture of a man of 50 or so. Both were strangers to him. He read their names and then the headlines. $100 million love was the caption, and after the word love was a dollar sign. Youth and age, beauty and the other thing, two great fortunes united. He caught the idea and looked at Mary Standish. It was impossible for him to think of her as Mary Graham. "I tore that from a paper in Cordova," she said. "They have nothing to do with me. The girl lives in Texas. But don't you see something in her eyes? Can't you see it, even in the picture? She has on her wedding things, but it seemed to me, when I saw her face, that in her eyes were agony and despair and hopelessness, and that she was bravely trying to hide them from the world. It's just another proof, one of thousands, that such unreasonable things do happen." He was beginning to feel a dull and painless sort of calm, the stoicism which came to possess him whenever he was confronted by the inevitable. He sat down and, with his head bowed over it, took one of the limp little hands that lay in Mary Standish's lap. The warmth had gone out of it. It was cold and lifeless. He caressed it gently and held it between his brown, muscular hands, staring at it and yet seeing nothing in particular. It was only the ticking of Keok's clock that broke the silence for a time. Then he released the hand, and it dropped in the girl's lap again. She had been looking steadily at the streak of grey in his hair, and a light came into her eyes, a light which he did not see, and a little tremble of her lips, and an almost imperceptible inclination of her head toward him. "I'm sorry, I didn't know," he said. "I realize now how you must have felt back there in the cottonwoods." "No, you don't realize, you don't," she protested. In an instant it seemed to him a vibrant, flaming life swept over her again. It was as if his words had touched fire to some secret thing, as if he had unlocked a door which grim hopelessness had closed. He was amazed at the swiftness with which color came into her cheeks. "You don't understand, and I am determined that you shall," she went on. "I would die before I let you go away thinking what is now in your mind. You will despise me, but I would rather be hated for the truth than because of the horrible thing which you must believe if I remain silent." She forced a wan smile to her lips. "You know, Belinda Mulrooneys were very well in their day, but they don't fit in now, do they? If a woman makes a mistake and tries to remedy it in a fighting sort of way, as Belinda Mulrooney might have done back in the days when Alaska was young." She finished with a little gesture of despair. "I have committed a great folly," she said, hesitating an instant in his silence. "I see very clearly now the course I should have taken. You will advise me that it is still not too late when you have heard what I am going to say. Your face is like a rock." "It is because your tragedy is mine," he said. She turned her eyes from him. The color in her cheeks deepened. It was a vivid, feverish glow. "I was born rich, enormously, hatefully rich," she said in the low, unimpassioned voice of a confessional. "I don't remember father or mother. I lived always with my grandfather Standish and my uncle Peter Standish. Until I was 13 I had my uncle Peter, who was grandfather's brother and lived with us. I worshipped Uncle Peter. He was a cripple. From young manhood he had lived in a wheelchair, and he was nearly 75 when he died. As a baby that wheelchair and my rides in it with him about the great house in which we lived were my delights. He was my father and mother, everything that was good and sweet in life. I remember thinking as a child that if God was as good as Uncle Peter, he was a wonderful God. It was Uncle Peter who told me, year after year, the old stories and legends of the Standishes, and he was always happy and glad and seeing nothing but sunshine, though he hadn't stood on his feet for nearly 60 years. And my Uncle Peter died when I was 13, 5 days before my birthday came. I think he must have been to me what your father was to you." He nodded. There was something that was not the hardness of rock in his face now, and John Graham seemed to have faded away. "I was left then alone with my grandfather Standish," she went on. "He didn't love me as Uncle Peter loved me, and I don't think I loved him. But I was proud of him. I thought the whole world must have stood in awe of him, as I did. As I grew older I learned the world was afraid of him. Bankers, presidents, even the strongest men in great financial interests, afraid of him and of his partners, the Grahams, and of Sharpley, who my Uncle Peter had told me was the cleverest lawyer in the nation, and who had grown up in the business of the two families. My grandfather was 68 when Uncle Peter died, So it was John Graham who was the actual working force behind the combined fortunes of the two families. Sometimes, as I now recall it, Uncle Peter was like a little child. I remember how he tried to make me understand just how big my grandfather's interests were by telling me that if $2 were taken from every man, woman and child in the United States, it would just about add up to what he and the Grahams possessed, and my grandfather Standish's interests were 3/4 of the whole. I remember how a haunted look would come into my Uncle Peter's face at times when I asked him how all this money was used, and where it was. And he never answered me as I wanted to be answered, and I never understood. I didn't know why people feared my grandfather and John Graham. I didn't know of the stupendous power my grandfather's money had rolled up for them. I didn't know. Her voice sank to a shuddering whisper. I didn't know how they were using it in Alaska, for instance. I didn't know it was feeding upon starvation and ruin and death. I don't think even Uncle Peter knew that. She looked at Alan steadily, and her grey eyes seemed burning up with a slow fire. Why, even then, before Uncle Peter died, I had become one of the biggest factors in all their schemes. It was impossible for me to suspect that John Graham was anticipating a little girl of 13. And I didn't guess that my grandfather Standish, so straight, so grandly white of beard and hair, so like a god of power when he stood among men, was even then planning that I should be given to him, so that a monumental combination of wealth might increase itself still more in that juggernaut of financial achievement for which he lived. And to bring about my sacrifice, to make sure it would not fail, they set Sharpleigh to the task, because Sharpleigh was sweet and good of face, and gentle like Uncle Peter, so that I loved him and had confidence in him, without a suspicion that under his white hair lay a brain which matched in cunning and mercilessness that of John Graham himself. And he did his work well, Alan. A second time she had spoken his name, softly and without embarrassment. With her nervous fingers tying and untying the two corners of a little handkerchief in her lap, she went on, after a moment of silence in which the ticking of Keok's clock seemed tense and loud. When I was 17, Grandfather Standish died. I wish you could understand all that followed without my telling you how I clung to Sharpleigh as a father, how I trusted him, and how cleverly and gently he educated me to the thought that it was right and just, and my greatest duty in life, to carry out the stipulation of my grandfather's will and marry John Graham. Otherwise, he told me, if that union was not brought about before I was 22, not a dollar of the great fortune would go to the house of Standish. And because he was clever enough to know that money alone would not urge me, he showed me a letter which he said my Uncle Peter had written, and which I was to read on my 17th birthday. And in that letter Uncle Peter urged me to live up to the Standish name and join in that union of the two great fortunes which he and Grandfather Standish had always planned. I didn't dream the letter was a forgery, and in the end they won, and I promised." She sat with bowed head, crumpling the bit of cambric between her fingers. "Do you despise me?" she asked. "No," he replied in a tense, unimpassioned voice. "I love you." She tried to look at him calmly and bravely. In his face again lay the immobility of rock, and in his eyes a sullen, slumbering fire. "I promised," she repeated quickly, as if regretting the impulse that had made her ask him the question. "But it was to be business. A cold, unsentimental business. I disliked John Graham, yet I would marry him. In the eyes of the law I would be his wife. In the eyes of the world I would remain his wife, but never more than that. They agreed, and I, in my ignorance, believed. I didn't see the trap. I didn't see the wicked triumph in John Graham's heart. No power could have made me believe then that he wanted to possess only me, that he was horrible enough to want me even without love, that he was a great monster of a spider, and I the fly lured into his web. And then the agony of it was that in all the years since Uncle Peter died I had dreamt strange and beautiful dreams. I lived in a make-believe world of my own, and I read, and the thought grew stronger and stronger in me that I had lived another life somewhere, and that I belonged back in the years when the world was clean, and there was love and vast reaches of land wherein money and power were little guessed of, and where romance and the glory of manhood and womanhood rose above all other things. Oh, I wanted these things. And yet, because others had moulded me, and because of my misguided Standish sense of pride and honour, I was shackling myself to John Graham. In the last month preceding my 22nd birthday, I learned more of the man than I had ever known before. Rumours came to me. I investigated a little, and I began to find the hatred and the reason for it which has come to me so conclusively here in Alaska. I almost knew at the last that he was a monster, but the world had been told I was to marry him, and Sharpleigh with his fatherly hypocrisy was behind me, and John Graham treated me so courteously and so coolly that I did not suspect the terrible things in his heart and mind. And I went on with the bargain. I married him. She drew a sudden deep breath, as if she had passed through the ordeal of what she had most dreaded to say. And now, meeting the changeless expression of Alan's face with a fierce little cry that leaped from her like a flash of gunfire, she sprang to her feet and stood with her back crushed against the tundra flowers, her voice trembling as she continued, while he stood up and faced her. "You needn't go on," he interrupted in a voice so low and terrible hard that she felt the menacing thrill of it. "You needn't. I will settle with John Graham if God gives me the chance." "You would have me stop now, before I have told you of the only shred of triumph to which I may lay claim," she protested. "Oh, you may be sure that I realize the sickening folly and wickedness of it all. But I swear before my God that I didn't realize it then, until it was too late. To you, Alan, clean as the great mountains and plains that have been part of you, I know how impossible this must seem. That I should marry a man I at first feared, then loathed, then came to hate with a deadly hatred. That I should sacrifice myself because I thought it was a duty. That I should be so weak, so ignorant, so like soft clay in the hands of those I trusted. Yet I tell you that at no time did I think or suspect that I was sacrificing myself. At no time, blind though you may call me, did I see a hint of that sickening danger into which I was voluntarily going. No, not even an hour before the wedding did I suspect that, for it had all been so coldly planned, like a great deal in finance, so carefully adjudged by us all as a business affair, that I felt no fear except that sickness of soul which comes of giving up one's life. And no hint of it came until the last of the few words were spoken which made us man and wife. And then I saw in John Graham's eyes something which I had never seen before, and Sharpleigh. Her hands caught at her breast, Her grey eyes were pools of flame. I went to my room. I didn't lock my door, because never had it been necessary to do that. I didn't cry. No, I didn't cry. But something strange was happening to me, which tears might have prevented. It seemed to me there were many walls to my room. I was faint. The windows seemed to appear and disappear, and in that sickness I reached my bed. Then I saw the door open, and John Graham came in and closed the door behind him and locked it. My room! He had come into my room! The unexpectedness of it, the horror, the insult roused me from my stupor. I sprang up to face him, and there he stood within arm's reach of me, a look in his face which told me at last the truth which I had failed to suspect or fear. His arms were reaching out. "You are my wife," he said. Oh, I knew then. "You are my wife," he repeated. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. And then his arms reached me. I felt them crushing around me like the coils of a great snake. The poison of his lips was at my face, and I believed that I was lost, and that no power could save me in this hour from the man who had come to my room, the man who was my husband. I think it was Uncle Peter who gave me voice, who put the right words in my brain, who made me laugh, yes, laugh, and almost caress him with my hands. The change in me amazed him, stunned him, and he freed me, while I told him that in these first few hours of wifehood I wanted to be alone, and that he should come to me that evening, and that I would be waiting for him. And I smiled at him as I said these things, smiled while I wanted to kill him. And he went, a great, gloating, triumphant beast, believing that the obedience of wifehood was about to give him what he had expected to find through dishonor, and I was left alone. I thought of only one thing then, escape. I saw the truth. It swept over me, inundated me, roared in my ears. All that I had ever lived with Uncle Peter came back to me. This was not his world. It had never been, and it was not mine. It was, all at once, a world of monsters. I wanted never to face it again, never to look into the eyes of those I had known. And even as these thoughts and desires swept upon me, I was filling a traveling bag in a fever of madness, and Uncle Peter was at my side, urging me to hurry, telling me I had no minutes to lose. For the man who had left me was clever and might guess the truth that lay hid behind my smiles and cajolery. I stole out through the back of the house, and as I went I heard Sharpleigh's low laughter in the library. It was a new kind of laughter, and with it I heard John Graham's voice. I was thinking only of the sea, to get away on the sea. A taxi took me to my bank, and I drew money. I went to the wharves, intent only on boarding a ship, any ship, and it seemed to me that Uncle Peter was leading me, and we came to a great ship that was leaving for Alaska, and you know what happened then, Alan Holt." With a sob she bowed her face in her hands, but only an instant it was there. And when she looked at Alan again, there were no tears in her eyes, but a soft glory of pride and exultation. "I'm clean of John Graham," she cried. "Clean!" He stood twisting his hands, twisting them in a helpless, futile sort of way, and it was he and not the girl who felt like bowing his head that the tears might come unseen. For her eyes were bright and shining and clear as stars. "Do you despise me now?" "I love you," he said again, and made no movement toward her. "I am glad," she whispered, and she did not look at him, but at the sunlit plain which lay beyond the window. And Rossland was on the Nome and saw you and sent word back to Graham, he said, fighting to keep himself from going nearer to her. She nodded. Yes, and so I came to you, and failing there I leaped into the sea, for I wanted them to think I was dead. And Rossland was hurt. Yes, strangely. I heard of it in Cordova. Men like Rossland frequently come to unexpected ends. He went to the door which she had closed, and opened it, and stood looking toward the blue billows of the foothills, with the white crests of the mountains behind them. She came after a moment and stood beside him. "I understand," she said softly, and her hand lay in a gentle touch upon his arm. "You are trying to see some way out, and you can see only one. That is to go back, face the creatures I hate, regain my freedom in the old way. And I, too, can see no other way. I came on impulse. I must return with impulse and madness burned out of me. And I am sorry. I dread it. I would rather die." "And I," he began, then caught himself and pointed to the distant hills and mountains. "The herds are there," he said. "I am going to them. I may be gone a week or more. Will you promise me to be here when I return?" "Yes, if that is your desire." "It is." She was so near that his lips might have touched her shining hair. "And when you return I must go? That will be the only way." "I think so." "It will be hard. It may be after all that I am a coward, but to face all that alone." "You won't be alone," he said quietly, still looking at the faraway hills. "If you go, I am going with you." It seemed as if she had stopped breathing for a moment at his side, and then with a little sobbing cry she drew away from him and stood at the half-opened door of Nawadlook's room, and the glory in her eyes was the glory of his dreams, as if he had wandered with her hand in hand over the tundras in those days of grief and half-madness when he had thought she was dead. "I am glad I was in Ellen McCormick's cabin the day you came," she was saying. "And I thank God for giving me the madness and courage to come to you. I am not afraid of anything in the world now, because I love you, Alan." And as Nawadlook's door closed behind her, Alan stumbled out into the sunlight, a great drumming in his heart and a tumult in his brain that twisted the world about him until for a little it held neither vision nor space nor sound. End of chapter 19 of The Alaskan by James Oliver Curwood. Read by Lars Rolander. Chapter 20 of The Alaskan. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Lars Rolander. The Alaskan by James Oliver Curwood. Chapter 20. In that way, with the beautiful world swimming in sunshine and golden tundra haze until foothills and mountains were like castles in a dream, Alan Holt set off with Tautuk and Amuk Toolik, leaving Stampede and Keok and Nawadlook at the coral bars, with Stampede little regretting that he was left behind to guard the range. For a mighty resolution had taken root in the prospector's heart, and he felt himself thrilled and a bit trembling at the nearness of the greatest drama that had ever entered his life. Alan, looking back after the first few minutes, saw that Keok and Nawadlook stood alone. Stampede was gone. The ridge beyond the coulée, out of which Mary Standish had come with wild flowers, soon closed like a door between him and Sokwenna's cabin, and the straight trail to the mountains lay ahead, and over this Alan set the pace with Tautuk and Amuk Toolik and a caravan of 7 pack deer behind him bearing supplies for the herdsmen. Alan had scarcely spoken to the two men. He knew the driving force which was sending him to the mountains was not only an impulse, but almost an inspirational thing born of necessity. Each step that he took, with his head and heart in a swirl of intoxicating madness, was an effort behind which he was putting a sheer weight of physical will. He wanted to go back. The urge was upon him to surrender utterly to the weakness of forgetting that Mary Standish was a wife. He had almost fallen a victim to his selfishness and passion in the moment when she stood at Nawadlook's door telling him that she loved him. An iron hand had drawn him out into the day, and it was the same iron hand that kept his face to the mountains now, while in his brain her voice repeated the words that had set his world on fire. He knew what had happened this morning was not the merely important and essential incident of most human lives. It had been a cataclysmic thing with him. Probably it would be impossible for even the girl ever fully to understand. And he needed to be alone to gather strength and mental calmness for the meeting of the problem ahead of him. A complication so unexpected that the very foundation of that stoic equanimity which the mountains had bred in him had suffered a temporary upsetting. His happiness was almost an insanity. The dream wherein he had wandered with the spirit of the dead had come true. It was the old idol in the flesh again. His father, his mother, and back in the cabin beyond the ridge such a love had cried out to him. And he was afraid to return. He laughed the fact aloud, happily and with an unrepressed exultation as he strode ahead of the pack train. And with that exultation words came to his lips, words intended for himself alone, telling him that Mary Standish belonged to him, and that until the end of eternity he would fight for her and keep her. Yet he kept on facing the mountains, and he walked so swiftly that Tautuk and Amuk Toolik fell steadily behind with the deer, so that in time long dips and swells of the tundra lay between them. With grim persistence he kept at himself, and at last there swept over him in its ultimate triumph a compelling sense of the justice of what he had done. Justice to Mary Standish. Even now he did not think of her as Mary Graham, but she was Graham's wife. And if he had gone to her in that moment of glorious confession when she had stood at Nawadlook's door, if he had violated her faith when, because of faith, she had laid the world at his feet, he would have fallen to the level of John Graham himself. Thought of the narrowness of his escape, and of the first mad desire to call her back from Nawadlook's room, to hold her in his arms again as he had held her in the cottonwoods, brought a hot fire into his face. Something greater than his own fighting instinct had turned him to the open door of the cabin. It was Mary Standish, her courage, the glory of faith and love shining in her eyes, her measurement of him as a man. She had not been afraid to say what was in her heart, because she knew what he would do. Mid-afternoon found him waiting for Tautuk and Amuk Toolik at the edge of a slough where willows grew deep and green and the crested billows of sedge cotton stood knee-high. The faces of the herdsmen were sweating. Thereafter Alan walked with them, until in that hour when the sun had sunk to its lowest plane they came to the first of the Endicott foothills. Here they rested until the coolness of deeper evening, when a golden twilight filled the land, and then resumed the journey toward the mountains. Midsummer heat and the winged pests of the lower lands had driven the herds steadily into the cooler altitudes of the higher plateaux and valleys. Here they had split into telescoping columns, which drifted in slowly moving streams wherever the doors of the hills and mountains opened into new grazing fields, until Alan's 10,000 reindeer were in three divisions, two of the greatest traveling westward, and one of 1,000 head working north and east. The first and second days Alan remained with the nearest and southward herd. The third day he went on with Tautuk and two pack deer through a break in the mountains and joined the herdsmen of the second and higher multitude of feeding animals. There began to possess him a curious disinclination to hurry, and this aversion grew in a direct ratio with the thought which was becoming stronger in him with each mile and hour of his progress. A multitude of emotions were buried under the conviction that Mary Standish must leave the range when he returned. He had a grim sense of honor, and a particularly devout one when it had to do with women, and though he conceded nothing of right and justice in the relationship which existed between the woman he loved and John Graham, he knew that she must go. To remain at the range was the one impossible thing for her to do. He would take her to Tanana. He would go with her to the States. The matter would be settled in a reasonable and intelligent way, and when he came back he would bring her with him. But beneath this undercurrent of decision fought the thing which his will held down, and yet never quite throttled completely. That something which urged him with an unconquerable persistence to hold with his own hands what a glorious fate had given him, and to finish with John Graham, if it ever came to that, in the madly desirable way he visioned for himself in those occasional moments when the fires of temptation blazed hottest. The fourth night he said to Tautuk, "If Keok should marry another man, what would you do?" It was a moment before Tautuk looked at him, and in the herdsman's eyes was a wild mute question, as if suddenly there had leaped into his stolid mind a suspicion which had never come to him before. Alan laid a reassuring hand upon his arm. "I don't mean she's going to, Tautuk," he laughed. "She loves you, I know it, only you are so stupid and so slow and so hopeless as a lover that she is punishing you while she has the right, before she marries you. But if she should marry someone else, what would you do?" "My brother?" asked Tautuk. "No." "A relative?" "No." "A friend?" "No, a stranger. Someone who had injured you, for instance, someone Keok hated and who had cheated her into marrying him." "I would kill him," said Tautuk quietly. It was this night the temptation was strongest upon Alan. Why should Mary Standish go back, he asked himself. She had surrendered everything to escape from the horror down there. She had given up fortune and friends. She had scattered convention to the four winds, had gambled her life in the hazard, and in the end had come to him. Why should he not keep her? John Graham and the world believed she was dead, and he was master here. If some day Graham should happen to cross his path, he would settle the matter in Tautuk's way. Later, while Tautuk slept and the world lay about him in a soft glow, and the valley below was filled with misty billows of twilight, out of which came to him faintly the curious crackling sound of reindeer hoofs and the grunting contentment of the feeding herd, the reaction came, as he had known it would come in the end. The morning of the fifth day he set out alone for the eastward herd, and on the sixth overtook Tatpan and his herdsmen. Tatpan, like Sokwenna's foster children Keok and Nawadlook, had a quarter strain of white in him, and when Alan came up to him in the edge of the valley where the deer were grazing, he was lying on a rock playing Yankee Doodle on a mouth organ. It was Tatpan who told him that an hour or two before an exhausted stranger had come into camp, looking for him, and that the man was asleep now, apparently more dead than alive, but had given instructions to be awakened at the end of 2 hours, and not a minute later. Together they had a look at him. He was a small, ruddy-faced man with a carroty blond hair and a peculiarly boyish appearance as he lay doubled up like a jackknife, profoundly asleep. Tatpan looked at his big silver watch and in a low voice described how the stranger had stumbled into camp, so tired he could scarcely put one foot ahead of the other, and that he had dropped down where he now lay when he learned Alan was with one of the other herds. "He must have come a long distance," said Tatpan, "and he has traveled fast." Something familiar about the man grew upon Alan, yet he could not place him. He wore a gun which he had unbelted and placed within reach of his hand on the grass. His chin was pugnaciously prominent, and in sleep the mysterious stranger had crooked a forefinger and thumb about his revolver in a way that spoke of caution and experience. "If he is in such a hurry to see me, you might awaken him," said Alan. He turned a little aside and knelt to drink in a tiny stream of water that ran down from the snowy summits, and he could hear Tatpan rousing the stranger. By the time he had finished drinking and faced about, the little man with the carroty blond hair was on his feet. Alan stared, and the little man grinned. His ruddy cheeks grew pinker, his blue eyes twinkled, and in what seemed to be a moment of embarrassment he gave his gun a sudden snap that drew an exclamation of amazement from Alan. Only one man in the world had he ever seen throw a gun into its holster like that. A sickly grin began to spread over his own countenance, and all at once Tatpan's eyes began to bulge. "Stampede!" he cried. Stampede rubbed a hand over his smooth, prominent chin and nodded apologetically. "It is me," he conceded. "I had to do it. It was give one or the other up, my whiskers or her. They went hard too. I flipped dice and the whiskers won. I cut cards and the whiskers won. I played Klondike agin 'em and the whiskers busted the bank. Then I got mad and shaved 'em. Do I look so bad, Alan?" "You look 20 years younger," declared Alan, stifling his desire to laugh when he saw the other's seriousness. Stampede was thoughtfully stroking his chin. "Then why the devil did they laugh?" he demanded. "Mary Standish didn't laugh. She cried, just stood and cried, and then sat down and cried. She thought I was that blamed funny. And Keok laughed until she was sick and had to go to bed. That little devil of a Keok calls me Pinky now. And Miss Standish says it wasn't because I was funny that she laughed, but that the change in me was so sudden she couldn't help it. Nawadlook says I've got a characterful chin." Alan gripped his hand, and a swift change came over Stampede's face. A steely glitter shot into the blue of his eyes, and his chin hardened. Nature no longer disguised the Stampede Smith of other days, and Alan felt a new thrill and a new regard for the man whose hand he held. This at last was the man whose name had gone before him up and down the old trails, the man whose cool and calculating courage, whose fearlessness of death and quickness with a gun, had written pages in Alaskan history which would never be forgotten. Where his first impulse had been to laugh, he now felt the grim thrill and admiration of men of other days, who, when in Stampede's presence, knew they were in the presence of a master. The old Stampede had come to life again, and Alan knew why. The grip of his hand tightened, and Stampede returned it. "Some day, if we are lucky, there always comes a woman to make the world worth living in, Stampede," he said. "There does," replied Stampede. He looked steadily at Alan. "And I take it you love Mary Standish," he added, "and that you'd fight for her if you had to?" "I would," said Alan. "Then it's time you were traveling," advised Stampede significantly. "I've been 12 hours on the trail without a rest. She told me to move fast, and I've moved. I mean Mary Standish. She said it was almost a matter of life and death that I find you in a hurry. I wanted to stay, but she wouldn't let me. It's you she wants. Rossland is at the range." "Rossland?" "Yes, Rossland. And it's my guess John Graham isn't far away. I smell happenings, Alan. We'd better hurry." End of chapter 20 of The Alaskan by James Oliver Curwood. Read by Lars Rolander. Chapter 21 of The Alaskan. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Lars Rolander. The Alaskan by James Oliver Curwood. Chapter 21. Stampede had started with one of the 2 saddle deer left at the range. But to ride deer back successfully and with any degree of speed and specific direction was an accomplishment which he had neglected, and within the first half dozen miles he had abandoned the adventure to continue his journey on foot. As Tatpan had no saddle deer in his herd, and the swiftest messenger would require many hours in which to reach Amuk Toolik, Alan set out for his range within half an hour after his arrival at Tatpan's camp. Stampede, declaring himself a new man after his brief rest and the meal which followed it, would not listen to Alan's advice that he follow later, when he was more refreshed. A fierce and reminiscent gleam smoldered in the little gunfighter's eyes as he watched Alan during the first half-hour leg of their race through the foothills to the tundras. Alan did not observe it, or the grimness that had settled in the face behind him. His own mind was undergoing an upheaval of conjecture and wild questioning. That Rossland had discovered Mary Standish was not dead was the least astonishing factor in the new development. The information might easily have reached him through Sandy McCormick or his wife Ellen. The astonishing thing was that he had in some mysterious way picked up the trail of her flight 1,000 miles northward, and the still more amazing fact that he had dared to follow her and reveal himself openly at his range. His heart pumped hard, for he knew Rossland must be directly under Graham's orders. Then came the resolution to take Stampede into his confidence and to reveal all that had happened on the day of his departure for the mountains. He proceeded to do this without equivocation or hesitancy, for there now pressed upon him a grim anticipation of impending events ahead of them. Stampede betrayed no astonishment at the other's disclosures. The smoldering fire remained in his eyes, the immobility of his face unchanged. Only when Alan repeated in his own words Mary Standish's confession of love at Nawadlook's door did the fighting lines soften about his comrade's eyes and mouth. Stampede's lips responded with an oddly quizzical smile. "I knew that a long time ago," he said. "I guessed it that first night of storm in the coach up Chitina. I knew it for certain before we left Tanana. She didn't tell me, but I wasn't blind. It was the note that puzzled and frightened me, the note she stuffed in her slipper. And Rossland told me before I left that going for you was a wild goose chase, as he intended to take Mrs. John Graham back with him immediately." "And you left her alone after that?" Stampede shrugged his shoulders as he valiantly kept up with Alan's suddenly quickened pace. "She insisted, said it meant life and death for her. And she looked it, white as paper after her talk with Rossland. Besides—" "What?" "Sokwenna won't sleep until we get back. He knows. I told him. And he's watching from the garret window with a .303 Savage. I saw him pick off a duck the other day at 200 yards." They hurried on. After a little Alan said, with a fear which he could not name clutching at his heart, "Why did you say Graham might not be far away?" "In my bones," replied Stampede, his face hard as rock again. "In my bones." "Is that all?" "Not quite. I think Rossland told her. She was so white, and her hand cold as a lump of clay when she put it on mine. It was in her eyes, too. Besides, Rossland has taken possession of your cabin as though he owns it. I take it that means somebody behind him, a force, something big to reckon with. He asked me how many men we had. I told him, stretching it a little. He grinned. He couldn't keep back that grin. It was as if a devil in him slipped out from hiding for an instant." Suddenly he caught Alan's arm and stopped him. His chin shot out. The sweat ran from his face. For a full quarter of a minute the two men stared at each other. "Alan, we're short-sighted. I'm damned if I don't think we ought to call the herdsmen in, and every man with a loaded gun." "You think it's that bad?" "Might be, if Graham's behind Rossland and has men with him." "We're 2.5 hours from Tatpan," said Alan in a cold, unemotional voice. "He has only half a dozen men with him, and it will take at least 4 to make quick work in finding Tautuk and Amuk Toolik. There are 18 men with the southward herd and 22 with the upper. I mean counting the boys. Use your own judgment. All are armed. It may be foolish, but I'm following your hunch." They gripped hands. "It's more than a hunch," Alan breathed Stampede softly. "And for God's sake, keep off the music as long as you can." He was gone, and as his agile, boyish figure started in a half run toward the foothills, Alan set his face southward, so that in a quarter of an hour they were lost to each other in the undulating distance of the tundra. Never had Alan traveled as on the last of this 6th day of his absence from the range. He was comparatively fresh, as his trail to Tatpan's camp had not been an exhausting one, and his more intimate knowledge of the country gave him a decided advantage over Stampede. He believed he could make the distance in 10 hours, but to this he would be compelled to add a rest of at least 3 or 4 hours during the night. It was now 8 o'clock. By 9 or 10 the next morning he would be facing Rossland, and at about the same hour Tatpan's swift messengers would be closing in about Tautuk and Amuk Toolik. He knew the speed with which his herdsmen would sweep out of the mountains and over the tundras. 2 years ago Amuk Toolik and a dozen of his Eskimo people had traveled 52 hours without rest or food, covering 119 miles in that time. His blood flushed hot with pride. He couldn't do that, but his people could and would. He could see them sweeping in from the telescoping segments of the herds as the word went among them. He could see them streaking out of the foothills, and then, like wolves scattering for free air and leg room, he saw them dotting the tundra in their race for home and war, if it was war that lay ahead of them. Twilight began to creep in upon him, like veils of cool, dry mist out of the horizons. And hour after hour he went on, eating a strip of pemmican when he grew hungry, and drinking in the spring coulees when he came to them, where the water was cold and clear. Not until a telltale cramp began to bite warningly in his leg did he stop for the rest which he knew he must take. It was 1 o'clock. Counting his journey to Tatpan's camp, he had been traveling almost steadily for 17 hours. Not until he stretched himself out on his back in a grassy hollow where a little stream a foot wide rippled close to his ears did he realize how tired he had become. At first he tried not to sleep. Rest was all he wanted. He dared not close his eyes, but exhaustion overcame him at last, and he slept. When he awoke, birdsong and the sun were taunting him. He sat up with a jerk, then leaped for his feet in alarm. His watch told the story. He had slept soundly for 6 hours, instead of resting 3 or 4 with his eyes open. After a little, as he hurried on his way, he did not altogether regret what had happened. He felt like a fighting man. He breathed deeply, ate a breakfast of pemmican as he walked, and proceeded to make up lost time. The interval between 15 minutes of 12 and 12 he almost ran. The quarter of an hour brought him to the crest of the ridge from which he could look upon the buildings of the range. Nothing had happened that he could see. He gave a great gasp of relief, and in his joy he laughed. The strangeness of the laugh told him more than anything else the tension he had been under. Another half hour and he came up out of the dip behind Sokwenna's cabin and tried the door. It was locked. A voice answered his knock, and he called out his name. The bolt shot back, the door opened, and he stepped in. Nawadlook stood at her bedroom door, a gun in her hands. Keok faced him, holding grimly to a long knife, and between them, staring white-faced at him as he entered, was Mary Standish. She came forward to meet him, and he heard a whisper from Nawadlook and saw Keok follow her swiftly through the door into the other room. Mary Standish held out her hands to him a little blindly, and the tremble in her throat and the look in her eyes betrayed the struggle she was making to keep from breaking down and crying out in gladness at his coming. It was that look that sent a flood of joy into his heart, even when he saw the torture and hopelessness behind it. He held her hands close, and into her eyes he smiled in such a way that he saw them widen, as if she almost disbelieved. And then she drew in a sudden quick breath, and her fingers clung to him. It was as if the hope that had deserted her came in an instant into her face again. He was not excited, he was not even perturbed, now that he saw that light in her eyes and knew she was safe. But his love was there. She saw it and felt the force of it behind the deadly calmness with which he was smiling at her. She gave a little sob, so low it was scarcely more than a broken breath, a little cry that came of wonder, understanding, and unspeakable faith in this man who was smiling at her so confidently in the face of the tragedy that had come to destroy her. "Rossland is in your cabin," she whispered, "and John Graham is back there somewhere, coming this way. Rossland says if I don't go to him of my own free will." He felt the shudder that ran through her. "I understand the rest," he said. They stood silent for a moment. The grey-cheeked thrush was singing on the roof. Then, as if she had been a child, he took her face between his hands and bent her head back a little so that he was looking straight into her eyes, and so near that he could feel the sweet warmth of her breath. "You didn't make a mistake the day I went away?" he asked. "You love me?" "Yes." For a moment longer he looked into her eyes. Then he stood back from her. Even Keok and Nawadlook heard his laugh. It was strange, they thought, Keok with her knife and Nawadlook with her gun, for the bird was singing and Alan Holt was laughing, and Mary Standish was very still. Another moment later, from where he sat cross-legged at the little window in the attic, keeping his unsleeping vigil with a rifle across his knees, old Sokwenna saw his master walk across the open, and something in the manner of his going brought back a vision of another day long ago when Ghost Kloof had rung with the cries of battle, and the hands now gnarled and twisted with age had played their part in the heroic stand of his people against the oppressors from the farther north. Then he saw Alan go into the cabin where Rossland was, and softly his fingers drummed upon the ancient tom-tom which lay at his side. His eyes fixed themselves upon the distant mountains, and under his breath he mumbled the old chant of battle, dead and forgotten except in Sokwenna's brain, and after that his eyes closed, and again the vision grew out of darkness like a picture for him, a vision of twisting trails and of fighting men gathering with their faces set for war. End of chapter 21 of The Alaskan by James Oliver Curwood. Read by Lars Rolander.
Of The Alaskan. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Alaskan by James Oliver Curwood. Chapter 22. At the desk in Alan's living room sat Rossland, when the door opened behind him and the master of the range came in. He was not disturbed when he saw who it was, and rose to meet him. His coat was off, his sleeves rolled up, and it was evident that he was making no effort to conceal his freedom with Alan's books and papers. He advanced, holding out a hand. This was not the same Rossland who told Alan to attend to his own business on board the Nome. His attitude was that of one greeting a friend, smiling and affable even before he spoke. Something inspired Alan to return the smile. Behind that smile he was admiring the man's nerve. His hand met Rossland's casually, but there was no uncertainty in the warmth of the other's grip. "How do you do, Paris, old boy?" he greeted good-humoredly. "Saw you going into Helen a few minutes ago, so I've been waiting for you. She's a little frightened, and we can't blame her. Menelaus is mightily upset. But mind me, Holt, I'm not blaming you. I'm too good a sport. Clever, I call it. Damned clever. She's enough to turn any man's head. I only wish I were in your boots right now. I'd have turned traitor myself aboard the Nome if she had shown an inclination." He proffered a cigar, a big fat cigar with a gold band. It was inspiration again that made Alan accept it and light it. His blood was racing, but Rossland saw nothing of that. He observed only the nod, the cool smile on Alan's lips, the apparent nonchalance with which he was meeting the situation. It pleased Graham's agent. He reseated himself in the desk chair and motioned Alan to another chair near him. "I thought you were badly hurt," said Alan. "Nasty knife wound you got." Rossland shrugged his shoulders. "There you have it again, Holt, the hell of letting a pretty face run away with you. One of the Thlinkit girls down in the steerage, you know. Lovely little thing, wasn't she? Tricked her into my cabin all right, but she wasn't like some other Indian girls I've known. The next night a brother, or sweetheart, or whoever it was, got me through the open port. It wasn't bad. I was out of the hospital within a week. Lucky I was put there, too. Otherwise I wouldn't have seen Mrs. Graham one morning through the window. What a little our fortunes hang to at times, eh? If it hadn't been for the girl and the knife and the hospital, I wouldn't be here now, and Graham wouldn't be bleeding his heart out with impatience, and you, Holt, wouldn't be facing the biggest opportunity that will ever come into your life." "I'm afraid I don't understand," said Alan, hiding his face in the smoke of his cigar, and speaking with an apparent indifference which had its effect upon Rossland. "Your presence inclines me to believe that luck has rather turned against me. Where can my advantage be?" A grim seriousness settled into Rossland's eyes, and his voice became cool and hard. "Holt, as two men who are not afraid to meet unusual situations, we may as well call a spade in this matter. Don't you think so?" "Decidedly," said Alan. "You know that Mary Standish is really Mary Standish Graham, John Graham's wife?" "Yes." "And you probably know now why she jumped into the sea, and why she ran away from Graham?" "I do." "That saves a lot of talk. But there is another side to the story which you probably don't know, and I am here to tell it to you. John Graham doesn't care for a dollar of the Standish fortune. It's the girl he wants, and has always wanted. She has grown up under his eyes. From the day she was 14 years old he has lived and planned with the thought of possessing her. You know how he got her to marry him, and you know what happened afterward. But it makes no difference to him whether she hates him or not. He wants her, and this," he swept his arms out, "is the most beautiful place in the world in which to have her returned to him. I've been figuring from your books. Your property isn't worth over $100,000 as it stands on hoof to-day. I'm here to offer you 5 times that for it. In other words, Graham is willing to forfeit all action he might have personally against you for stealing his wife, and in place of that will pay you $500,000 for the privilege of having his honeymoon here, and making of this place a country estate where his wife may reside indefinitely, subject to her husband's visits when he is so inclined. There will be a stipulation, of course, requiring that the personal details of the deal be kept strictly confidential, and that you leave the country. Do I make myself clear?" Alan rose to his feet and paced thoughtfully across the room. At least Rossland measured his action as one of sudden, intensive reflection as he watched him, smiling complacently at the effect of his knockout proposition upon the other. He had not minced matters. He had come to the point without an effort at bargaining, and he possessed sufficient dramatic sense to appreciate what the offer of $500,000 meant to an individual who was struggling for existence at the edge of a raw frontier. Alan stood with his back toward him, facing a window. His voice was oddly strained when he answered, but that was quite natural, too, Rossland thought. "I am wondering if I understand you," he said. "Do you mean that if I sell Graham the range, leave it bag and baggage, and agree to keep my mouth shut thereafter, he will give me $500,000? "That is the price. You are to take your people with you. Graham has his own." Alan tried to laugh. "I think I see the point now. He isn't paying $500,000 for Miss Standish, I mean Mrs. Graham. He's paying it for the isolation." "Exactly. It was a last-minute hunch with him to settle the matter peaceably. We started up here to get his wife. You understand, to get her, and settled the matter with you in a different way from the one we're using now. You hit the word when you said isolation. What a damned fool a man can make of himself over a pretty face. Think of it, $500,000. "It sounds unreal," mused Alan, keeping his face to the window. "Why should he offer so much?" "You must keep the stipulation in mind, Holt. That is an important part of the deal. You are to keep your mouth shut. Buying the range at a normal price wouldn't guarantee it. But when you accept a sum like that, you are a partner in the other end of the transaction, and your health depends upon keeping the matter quiet. Simple enough, isn't it?" Alan turned back to the table. His face was pale. He tried to keep smoke in front of his eyes. "Of course, I don't suppose he'd allow Mrs. Graham to escape back to the States, where she might do a little upsetting on her own account." "He isn't throwing the money away," replied Rossland significantly. "She should remain here indefinitely?" "Indefinitely." "Probably would never return." "Strange how squarely you hit the nail on the head. Why should she return? The world believes she is dead. Papers were full of it. The little secret of her being alive is all our own. And this will be a beautiful summering place for Graham. Magnificent climate. Lovely flowers, birds, and the girl he has watched grow up and wanted since she was 14. "And who hates him." "True." "Who was tricked into marrying him, and who would rather die than live with him as his wife." "But it's up to Graham to keep her alive, Holt. That's not our business. If she dies, I imagine you will have an opportunity to get your range back pretty cheap." Rossland held a paper out to Alan. "Here's partial payment, 250,000. I have the papers here on the desk ready to sign. As soon as you give possession, I'll return to Tanana with you and make the remaining payment." Alan took the check. "I guess only a fool would refuse an offer like this, Rossland." "Yes, only a fool." "And I am that fool." So quietly did Alan speak that for an instant the significance of his words did not fall with full force upon Rossland. The smoke cleared away from before Alan's face. His cigar dropped to the floor, and he stepped on it with his foot. The check followed it in torn scraps. The fury he had held back with almost superhuman effort blazed in his eyes. "If I could have Graham where you are now, in that chair, I'd give 10 years of my life, Rossland. I would kill him. And you. He stepped back a pace, as if to put himself out of striking distance of the beast who was staring at him in amazement. "What you have said about her should condemn you to death, and I would kill you here in this room if it wasn't necessary for you to take my message back to Graham. Tell him that Mary Standish, not Mary Graham, is as pure and clean and as sweet as the day she was born. Tell him that she belongs to me. I love her. She is mine. Do you understand? And all the money in the world couldn't buy one hair from her head. I am going to take her back to the States. She is going to get a square deal, and the world is going to know her story. She has nothing to conceal. Absolutely nothing. Tell that to John Graham for me." He advanced upon Rossland, who had risen from his chair. His hands were clenched, his face a mask of iron. "Get out! Go, before I flay you within an inch of your rotten life." The energy which every fibre in him yearned to expend upon Rossland sent the table crashing back in an overturned wreck against the wall. "Go, before I kill you." He was advancing, even as the words of warning came from his lips, and the man before him, an awe-stricken mass of flesh that had forgotten power and courage in the face of a deadly and unexpected menace, backed quickly to the door and escaped. He made for the corrals, and Alan watched from his door until he saw him departing southward, accompanied by 2 men who bore packs on their shoulders. Not until then did Rossland gather his nerve sufficiently to stop and look back. His breathless voice carried something unintelligible to Alan, but he did not return for his coat and hat. The reaction came to Alan when he saw the wreck he had made of the table. Another moment or two and the devil in him would have been at work. He hated Rossland. He hated him now only a little less than he hated John Graham, and that he had let him go seemed a miracle to him. He felt the strain he had been under, but he was glad. Some little god of common sense had overruled his passion, and he had acted wisely. Graham would now get his message, and there would be no misunderstanding of purpose between them. He was staring at the disordered paper on his desk when a movement at the door turned him about. Mary Standish stood before him. "You sent him away?" she cried softly. Her eyes were shining, her lips parted, her face lit up with a beautiful glow. She saw the overturned table, Rossland's hat and coat on a chair, the evidence of what had happened and the quickness of his flight, and then she turned her face to Alan again, and what he saw broke down the last of that grim resolution which he had measured for himself, so that in a moment he was at her side and had her in his arms. She made no effort to free herself as she had done in the cottonwoods, but turned her mouth up for him to kiss, and then hid her face against his shoulder, while he, fighting vainly to find utterance for the thousand words in his throat, stood stroking her hair, and then buried his face in it, crying out at last in the warm sweetness of it that he loved her and was going to fight for her, and that no power on earth could take her away from him now. And these things he repeated until she raised her flushed face from his breast, and let him kiss her lips once more, and then freed herself gently from his arms. End of chapter 22.
Chapter 23 of the Alaskan. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Brian Hoos. The Alaskan by James Oliver Curwood. Chapter 23. For a space they stood apart, and in the radiant loveliness of Mary Standish's face, and in Alan's quiet and unimpassioned attitude, were neither shame nor regret. In a moment they had swept aside the barrier which convention had raised against them, and now they felt the inevitable thrill of joy and triumph, and not the humiliating embarrassment of dishonor. They made no effort to draw a curtain upon their happiness, or to hide the swift heartbeat of it from each other. It had happened, and they were glad. Yet they stood apart, and something pressed upon Alan the inviolableness of the little freedom of space between them, of its sacredness to Mary Standish, and darker and deeper grew the glory of pride and faith that lay with the love in her eyes when he did not cross it. He reached out his hand, and freely she gave him her own. Lips blushing with his kisses trembled in a smile, and she bowed her head a little, so that he was looking at her smooth hair, soft and sweet where he had caressed it a few moments before. "I thank God," he said. He did not finish the surge of gratitude that was in his heart. Speech seemed trivial, even futile, but she understood. He was not thanking God for that moment, but for a lifetime of something that at last had come to him. This, it seemed to him, was the end of a world as he had known it, the beginning of a new. He stepped back, and his hands trembled. For something to do, he set up the overturned table, and Mary Standish watched him with a quiet, satisfied wonder. She loved him, and she had come into his arms. She had given him her lips to kiss, and he laughed softly as he came to her side again and looked over the tundra where Rossland had gone. "How long before you can prepare for the journey?" he asked. "You mean that we must start tonight or in the morning?" "I think we shall go through the cottonwoods over the trail to Nome. Unless Rossland lied, Graham is somewhere out there on the Tanana Trail." Her hand pressed his arm. "We are going back, is that it, Alan?" "Yes, to Seattle. It is the one thing to do. You are not afraid?" "With you there, no." "And you will return with me when it is over?" He was looking steadily ahead, over the tundra, but he felt her cheek touch his shoulder, lightly as a feather. "Yes, I will come back with you." "And you will be ready?" "I am ready now." The sunfire of the plains danced in his eyes, a cobweb of golden mist rising out of the earth, beckoning wraiths and undulating visions, the breath of life, of warmth, of growing things, all between him and the hidden cottonwoods, a joyous sea into which he wanted to plunge without another minute of waiting. As he felt the gentle touch of her cheek against his shoulder and the weight of her hand on his arm, that she had come to him utterly was in the low surrender of her voice. She had ceased to fight. she had given to him the precious right to fight for her. It was this sense of her need, and of her glorious faith in him, and of the obligation pressing with it, that drove slowly back into him the grimmer realities of the day. Its horror surged upon him again, and the significance of what Rossland had said seemed fresher, clearer, even more terrible now that he was gone. Unconsciously, the old lines of hatred crept into his face again as he looked steadily in the direction of which the other man had taken, and he wondered how much of that same horror, of the unbelievable menace stealing upon her, Rossland had divulged to the girl who stood so quietly now at his side. Had he done right to let him go? Should he not have killed him as he would have exterminated a serpent? For Rossland had exulted. He was of Graham's flesh and desires, a part of his foul soul, a defiler of womanhood, and the one who had bargained to make possible the opportunity for an indescribable crime. It was not too late. He could still overtake him out there in the hollows of the tundra. The pressure on his arm tightened. He looked down. Mary Standish had seen what was in his face, and there was something in her calmness that brought him to himself. He knew in that moment that Rossland had told her a great deal, yet she was not afraid, unless it was a fear of what had been in his mind. "I am ready," she reminded him. "We must wait for Stampede," he said, reason returning to him. "He should be here sometime tonight or in the morning. Now that Rossland is off my nerves, I can see how necessary it is to have someone like Stampede between us and—" He did not finish, but what he had intended to say was quite clear to her. She stood in the doorway, and he felt an almost uncontrollable desire to take her in his arms again. "He is between here and Tanana," she said with a little gesture of her head. "Rossland told you that?" "Yes, and there are others with him. So many that he was amused when I told him you would not let them take me away." "Then you were not afraid that I might let them have you?" "I have always been sure of what you would do since I opened that second letter at Ellen McCormick's, Alan." He caught the flash of her eyes, the gladness in them, and she was gone before he could find another word to say. Keok and Nawadlook were still approaching hesitantly, but now they hurried to meet her, Keok still grimly clutching the long knife. And beyond them, at the little window under the roof, he saw the ghostly face of old Sokwina, like a death's head on guard. His blood ran a little faster. The emptiness of the tundras, the illimitable spaces without sign of human life, the vast stage waiting for its impending drama, with its sunshine, its song of birds, its whisper and breath of growing flowers, struck a new note in him, and he looked again at the little window where Sokwina sat like a spirit from another world, warning him in his silent and lifeless stare of something menacing and deadly creeping upon them out of that space which seemed so free of all evil. He beckoned to him and then entered his cabin, waiting while Sokwina crawled down from his post and came hobbling over the open, a crooked figure, bent like a baboon, witch-like in his great age, yet with sunken eyes that gleamed like little points of flame, and a quickness of movement that made Alan shiver as he watched him through the window. In a moment the old man entered. He was mumbling. He was saying in that jumble of sound which it was difficult for even Alan to understand, and which Sokwina had never given up for the missionary's teachings, that he could hear feet and smell blood, and that the feet were many, and the blood was near, and that both smell and footfall were coming from the old kloof where the yellow skulls still lay, dripping with the water that had once run red. Alan was one of the few who, by reason of much effort, had learned the story of the kloof from old Sokwina, how so long ago that Sokwina was a young man, a hostile tribe had descended upon his people, killing the men and stealing the women, and how at last Sokwina and a handful of his tribesmen fled south with what women were left, and made a final stand in the kloof. And there, on a day that was golden and filled with the beauty of birdsong and flowers, had ambushed their enemies and killed them to a man. All were dead now, all but Sokwina. For a space Alan was sorry he had called Sokwina to his cabin. He was no longer the cheerful and gentle old man of his people, the old man who chortled with joy at the prettiness and play of Keok and Nawadlook, who loved birds and flowers and little children, and who had retained an impish boyhood along with his great age. He was changed. He stood before Alan, an embodiment of fatalism, mumbling incoherent things in his breath, a spirit of evil omen lurking in his sunken eyes and his thin hands gripping like bird claws to his rifle. Alan threw off the uncomfortable feeling that he had gripped him for a moment and set him to an appointed task, the watching of the southward plain from the crest of the tall ridge 2 miles back on the Tanana Trail. He was to return when the sun reached its horizon. Alan was inspired now by a great caution, a growing premonition which stirred him with uneasiness, and he began his own preparations as soon as Sokwenna had started on his mission. The desire to leave at once, without the delay of an hour, pulled strong in him, but he forced himself to see the folly of such haste. He would be away many months, possibly a year this time. There was much to do, a mass of detail to attend to, a volume of instructions and advice to leave behind him. He must at least see Stampede, and it was necessary to write down certain laws for Tautuk and Amuktulik. As this work of preparation progressed, and the premonition persisted in remaining with him, he fell into a habit of repeating to himself the absurdity of fears and the impossibility of danger. He tried to make himself feel uncomfortably foolish at the thought of having ordered the herdsman in. In all probability Graham would not appear at all, he told himself, or at least not for many days or weeks. And if he did come, it would be to war in a legal way and not with murder. Yet his uneasiness did not leave him. As the hours passed and the afternoon lengthened, the invisible something urged him more strongly to take the trail beyond the cottonwoods, with Mary Standish at his side. Twice he saw her between noon and 5 o'clock, and by that time his writing was done. He looked at his guns carefully. He saw that his favorite rifle and automatic were working smoothly, and he called himself a fool for filling his ammunition vest with an extravagant number of cartridges. He even carried an amount of this ammunition and 2 of his extra guns to Sokwenna's cabin, with the thought that it was this cabin on the edge of the ravine which was best fitted for defense in the event of necessity. Possibly Stampede might have use for it and for the guns if Graham should come after he and Mary were well on their way to Nome. After supper, when the sun was throwing long shadows from the edge of the horizon, Alan came from a final survey of his cabin and the food which Wagarak had prepared for his pack, and found Mary at the edge of the ravine, watching the twilight gathering where the coulee ran narrower and deeper between the distant breasts of the tundra. "I'm going to leave you for a little while," he said, "but Sokwenna has returned, and you will not be alone." "Where are you going?" "As far as the cottonwoods, I think." "Then I am going with you." "I expect to walk very fast." "Not faster than I, Alan." "But I want to make sure the country is clear in that direction before twilight shuts out the distances." "I will help you." Her hand crept into his. "I am going with you, Alan," she repeated. "Yes, I think you are," he laughed joyously, and suddenly he bent his head and pressed her hand to his lips, and in that way, with her hand in his, they set out over the trail which they had not traveled together since the day he had come from Nome. There was a warm glow in her face, and something beautifully soft and sweet in her eyes which she did not try to keep away from him. It made him forget the cottonwoods and the plains beyond, and his caution, and Sokwenna's advice to guard carefully against the hiding places of Ghost Kloof and the country beyond. "I have been thinking a great deal today," she was saying, "because you have left me so much alone. I have been thinking of you, and my thoughts have given me a wonderful happiness." "And I have been in paradise," he replied. "You do not think that I am wicked?" "I could sooner believe the sun would never come up again." "Nor that I have been unwomanly?" "You are my dream of all that is glorious in womanhood." "Yet I have followed you, have thrust myself at you, fairly at your head, Alan." "For which I thank God," he breathed devoutly. "And I have told you that I love you, and you have taken me in your arms and have kissed me." "Yes." "And I am walking now with my hand in yours." "And will continue to do so if I can hold it." "And I am another man's wife," she shuddered. "You are mine," he declared doggedly. "You know it, and the Almighty God knows it. It is blasphemy to speak of yourself as Graham's wife. You are legally entangled with him, and that is all. Heart and soul and body you are free." "No, I am not free." "But you are." And then, after a moment, she whispered at his shoulder, "Alan, because you are the finest gentleman in all the world, I will tell you why I am not. It is because, heart and soul, I belong to you." He dared not look at her, and feeling the struggle within him, Mary Standish looked straight ahead with a wonderful smile on her lips, and repeated softly, "Yes, the very finest gentleman in all the world." Over the breasts of the tundra and the hollows between them they went, still hand in hand, and found themselves talking of the colorings of the sky and the birds and the flowers and the twilight creeping in about them, while Alan scanned the shortening horizons for a sign of human life. 1 mile, and then another, and after that a third, and they were looking into gray gloom far ahead, where lay the kloof. It was strange that he should think of the letter now, the letter he had written to Ellen McCormick, but think of it he did, and said what was in his mind to Mary Standish, who was also looking with him into the wall of gloom that lay between them and the distant cottonwoods. "It seemed to me that I was not writing to her, but to you," he said, "and I think that if you hadn't come back to me, I would have gone mad." "I have the letter. It is here," and she placed a hand upon her breast. "Do you remember what you wrote, Alan? That you meant more to me than life, and that particularly you wanted Ellen McCormick to keep a tress of my hair for you if they found me." He nodded. "When I sat across the table from you aboard the Nome, I worshipped it and didn't know it. And since then, since I've had you here every time I've looked at you—" He stopped, choking the words back in his throat. "Say it, Alan." "I wanted to see it down," he finished desperately. "Silly notion, isn't it?" "Why is it?" she asked, her eyes widening a little. "If you love it, why is it a silly notion to want to see it down?" "Why, I thought possibly you might think so," he added lamely. Never had he heard anything sweeter than her laughter as she turned suddenly from him, so that the glow of the fallen sun was at her back, and with deft, swift fingers began loosening the coils of her hair until its radiant masses tumbled about her, streaming down her back in a silken glory that awed him with its beauty, and drew from his lips a cry of gladness. She faced him, and in her eyes was the shining softness that glowed in her hair. "Do you think it is nice, Alan?" He went to her and filled his hands with the heavy tresses and pressed them to his lips and face. Thus he stood when he felt the sudden shiver that ran through her. It was like a little shock. He heard the catch of her breath, and the hand which she had placed gently on his bowed head fell suddenly away. When he raised his head to look at her, she was staring past him into the deepening twilight of the tundra, and it seemed as if something had stricken her so that for a space she was powerless to speak or move. "What is it?" he cried, and whirled about, straining his eyes to see what had alarmed her. And as he looked, a deep, swift shadow sped over the earth, darkening the mellow twilight until it was a somber gloom of night. And the midnight sun went out like a great luminous lamp as a dense wall of purple cloud rolled up in an impenetrable curtain between it and the Arctic world. Often he had seen this happen in the approach of a summer storm on the tundras, but never had the change seemed so swift as now. Where there had been golden light, he saw his companion's face now pale in a sea of dusk. It was this miracle of Arctic night, its suddenness and unexpectedness, that had startled her, he thought, and he laughed softly. But her hand clutched his arm. "I saw them," she cried, her voice breaking. "I saw them out there against the sun, before the cloud came, and some of them were running like animals." "Shadows!" he exclaimed. "The long shadows of foxes running against the sun, or of the big gray rabbits, or of a wolf and her half-grown sneaking away." "No, no, they were not that," she breathed tensely, and her fingers clung more fiercely to his arm. "They were not shadows. They were men." End of chapter 23.
Chapter 24 of The Alaskan. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Roger Moline. The Alaskan by James Oliver Curwood. Chapter 24. In the moment of stillness between them, when their hearts seemed to have stopped beating that they might not lose the faintest whispering of the twilight, a sound came to Alan, and he knew it was the toe of a boot striking against stone. Not a foot in his tribe would have made that sound, none but Stampede Smith's or his own. "Were they many?" he asked. "I could not see. The sun was darkening, but 5 or 6 were running—" "Behind us?" "Yes." "And they saw us?" "I think so. It was but a moment, and they were a part of the dusk." He found her hand and held it closely. Her fingers clung to his, and he could hear her quick breathing as he unbuttoned the flap of his automatic holster. "You think they have come?" she whispered, and a cold dread was in her voice. "Possibly. My people would not appear from that direction. You are not afraid?" "No, no, I am not afraid." "Yet you are trembling." "It is this strange gloom, Alan." Never had the Arctic twilight gone more completely. Not half a dozen times had he seen the phenomenon in all his years in the tundras, where thunderstorm and the putting out of the summer sun until twilight thickens into the gloom of near night is an occurrence so rare that it is more awesome than the weirdest play of the northern lights. It seemed to him now that what was happening was a miracle, the play of a mighty hand opening their way to salvation. An inky wall was shutting out the world where the glow of the midnight sun should have been. It was spreading quickly. Shadows became part of the gloom, and this gloom crept in, thickening, drawing nearer, until the tundra was a weird chaos, neither night nor twilight, challenging vision until eyes strained futilely to penetrate its mystery. And as it gathered about them, enveloping them in their own narrowing circle of vision, Alan was thinking quickly. It had taken him only a moment to accept the significance of the running figures his companion had seen. Graham's men were near, had seen them, and were getting between them and the range. Possibly it was a scouting party, and if there were no more than 5 or 6, the number which Mary had counted, he was quite sure of the situation. But there might be a dozen or 50 of them. It was possible Graham and Rossland were advancing upon the range with their entire force. He had at no time tried to analyze just what this force might be, except to assure himself that with the overwhelming influence behind him, both political and financial, and fired by a passion for Mary Standish that had revealed itself as little short of madness, Graham would hesitate at no convention of law or humanity to achieve his end. Probably he was playing the game so that he would be shielded by the technicalities of the law if it came to a tragic end. His gunmen would undoubtedly be impelled to a certain extent by an idea of authority. For Graham was an injured husband rescuing his wife, while he, Alan Holt, was the woman's abductor and paramour, and a fit subject to be shot upon sight. His free hand gripped the butt of his pistol as he led the way straight ahead. The sudden gloom helped to hide in his face the horror he felt of what that rescue would mean to Mary Standish. And then a cold and deadly definiteness possessed him, and every nerve in his body gathered itself in readiness for whatever might happen. If Graham's men had seen them and were getting between them and retreat, the neck of the trap lay ahead, and in this direction Alan walked so swiftly that the girl was almost running at his side. He could not hear her footsteps, so lightly they fell. Her fingers were twined about his own, and he could feel the silken caress of her loose hair. For half a mile he kept on, watching for a moving shadow, listening for a sound. Then he stopped. He drew Mary into his arms and held her there, so that her head lay against his breast. She was panting, and he could feel and hear her thumping heart. He found her parted lips and kissed them. "You are not afraid?" he asked again. Her head made a fierce little negative movement against his breast. "No." He laughed softly at the beautiful courage with which he lied. "Even if they saw us, and are Graham's men, we have given them the slip," he comforted her. "Now we will circle eastward back to the range. I am sorry I hurried you so. We will go more slowly." "We must travel faster," she insisted. "I want to run." Her fingers sought his hand and clung to it again as they set out. At intervals they stopped, staring about them into nothingness, and listening. Twice Alan thought he heard sounds which did not belong to the night. The second time the little fingers tightened about his own, but his companion said no word, only her breath seemed to catch in her throat for an instant. At the end of another half hour it was growing lighter, yet the breath of storm seemed nearer. The cool promise of it touched their cheeks, and about them were gathering whispers and eddies of a thirsty earth rousing to the sudden change. It was lighter because the wall of cloud seemed to be distributing itself over the whole heaven, thinning out where its solid opaqueness had lain against the sun. Alan could see the girl's face and the cloud of her hair. Hollows and ridges of the tundra were taking more distinct shape when they came into a dip, and Alan recognized a thicket of willows behind which a pool was hidden. The thicket was only half a mile from home. A spring was near the edge of the willows, and to this he led the girl, made her a place to kneel, and showed her how to cup the cool water in the palms of her hands. While she inclined her head to drink, he held back her hair and rested with his lips pressed to it. He heard the trickle of water running between her fingers, her little laugh of half pleasure, half fear, which in another instant broke into a startled scream as he half gained his feet to meet the crashing body that catapulted at him from the concealment of the willows. A greater commotion in the thicket followed the attack, then another voice, crying out sharply, a second cry from Mary Standish, and he found himself on his knees, twisted backward and fighting desperately to loosen a pair of gigantic hands at his throat. He could hear the girl struggling, but she did not cry out again. In an instant, it seemed, his brain was reeling. He was conscious of a futile effort to reach his gun, and could see the face over him, grim and horrible in the gloom, as the merciless hands choked the life from him. Then he heard a shout, a loud shout, filled with triumph and exultation as he was thrown back. His head seemed leaving his shoulders. His body crumbled, and almost spasmodically his legs shot out with the last strength that was in him. He was scarcely aware of the great gasp that followed, but the fingers loosened at his throat, the face disappeared, and the man who was killing him sank back. For a precious moment or two Alan did not move as he drew great breaths of air into his lungs. Then he felt for his pistol. The holster was empty. He could hear the panting of the girl, her sobbing breath very near him, and life and strength leaped back into his body. The man who had choked him was advancing again, on hands and knees. In a flash Alan was up and on him like a lithe cat. His fist beat into a bearded face. He called out to Mary as he struck, and through his blows saw her where she had fallen to her knees, with a second hulk bending over her, almost in the water of the little spring from which she had been drinking. A mad curse leaped from his lips. He was ready to kill now. He wanted to kill, to destroy what was already under his hands, that he might leap upon this other beast, who stood over Mary Standish, his hands twisted in her long hair. Dazed by blows that fell with the force of a club, the bearded man's head sagged backward, and Alan's fingers dug into his throat. It was a bull's neck. He tried to break it. 10 seconds, 20, half a minute at the most, and flesh and bone would have given way, but before the bearded man's gasping cry was gone from his lips, the second figure leaped upon Alan. He had no time to defend himself from this new attack. His strength was half gone, and a terrific blow sent him reeling. Blindly he reached out and grappled. Not until his arms met those of his fresh assailant did he realize how much of himself he had expended upon the other. A sickening horror filled his soul as he felt his weakness, and an involuntary moan broke from his lips. Even then he would have cut out his tongue to have silenced that sound, to have kept it from the girl. She was creeping on her hands and knees, but he could not see. Her long hair trailed in the trampled earth and in the muddied water of the spring, and her hands were groping, groping, until they found what they were seeking. Then she rose to her feet, carrying the rock on which one of her hands had rested when she knelt to drink. The bearded man, bringing himself to his knees, reached out drunkenly. But she avoided him and poised herself over Alan and his assailant. The rock descended. Alan saw her then. He heard the one swift, terrible blow, and his enemy rolled away from him, limply and without sound. He staggered to his feet and for a moment caught the swaying girl in his arms. The bearded man was rising. He was half on his feet when Alan was at his throat again, and they went down together. The girl heard blows, then a heavier one, and with an exclamation of triumph Alan stood up. By chance his hand had come in contact with his fallen pistol. He clicked the safety down. He was ready to shoot, ready to continue the fight with a gun. "Come," he said. His voice was gasping, strangely unreal and thick. She came to him and put her hand on his again, and it was wet and sticky with tundra mud from the spring. Then they climbed to the swell of the plain, away from the pool and the willows. In the air about them, creeping up from the outer darkness of the strange twilight, were clearer whispers now, and with these sounds of storm, borne from the west, came a hallooing voice. It was answered from straight ahead. Alan held the muddied little hand closer in his own and set out for the range houses from which direction the last voice had come. He knew what was happening. Graham's men were cleverer than he had supposed. They had encircled the tundra side of the range, and some of them were closing in on the willow pool from which the triumphant shout of the bearded man's companion had come. They were wondering why the call was not repeated, and were hallooing. Every nerve in Alan's body was concentrated for swift and terrible action, for the desperateness of their situation had surged upon him like a breath of fire, unbelievable and yet true. Back at the willows they would have killed him. The hands at his throat had sought his life. Wolves and not men were about them on the plain, wolves headed by two monsters of the human pack, Graham and Rossland. Murder and lust and mad passion were hidden in the darkness. Law and order and civilization were hundreds of miles away. If Graham won, only the unmapped tundras would remember this night, as the deep, dark kloof remembered in its gloom the other tragedy of more than a half a century ago. And the girl at his side, already disheveled and muddied by their hands, his mind could go no farther, and angry protest broke in a low cry from his lips. The girl thought it was because of the shadows that loomed up suddenly in their path. There were two of them, and she too cried out as voices commanded them to stop. Alan caught a swift up-movement of an arm, but his own was quicker. 3 spurts of flame darted in lightning flashes from his pistol, and the man who had raised his arm crumpled to the earth, while the other dissolved swiftly into the storm gloom. A moment later his wild shouts were assembling the pack, while the detonations of Alan's pistol continued to roll over the tundra. The unexpectedness of the shots, their tragic effect, the falling of the stricken man and the flight of the other, brought no word from Mary Standish. But her breath was sobbing, and in the lifting of the purplish gloom she turned her face for an instant to Alan, tensely white, with wide open eyes. Her hair covered her like a shining veil, and where it clustered in a disheveled mass upon her breast, Alan saw her hand thrusting itself forward from its clinging concealment, and in it, to his amazement, was a pistol. He recognized the weapon, one of a brace of light automatics which his friend, Carl Loman, had presented to him several Christmas seasons ago. Pride and a strange exultation swept over him. Until now she had concealed the weapon, but all along she had prepared to fight with him against their enemies. He wanted to stop and take her in his arms, and with his kisses tell her how splendid she was. But instead of this he sped more swiftly ahead, and they came into a niggerhead bottom which lay in a narrow barrier between them and the range. Through this ran a trail scarcely wider than a wagon track, made through the sea of hummocks and sedge bowls and mucky pitfalls by the axes and shovels of his people. Finding this, Alan stopped for a moment, knowing that safety lay ahead of them. The girl leaned against him, and then was almost a dead weight in his arms. The last 200 yards had taken the strength from her body. Her pale face dropped back, and Alan brushed the soft hair away from it, and kissed her lips and her eyes, while the pistol lay clenched against his breast. Even then, too hard run to speak, she smiled at him, and Alan caught her up in his arms and darted into the narrow path which he knew their pursuers would not immediately find if they could bet beyond their vision. He was joyously amazed at her lightness. She was like a child in his arms, a glorious little goddess hidden and smothered in her long hair, and he held her closer as he hurried toward the cabins, conscious of the soft tightening of her arms about his neck, feeling the sweet caress of her panting breath, strengthened and made happy by her helplessness. Thus they came out of the bottom as the first mist of slowly approaching rain touched his face. He could see farther now, halfway back over the narrow trail. He climbed a slope, and here Mary Standish slipped from his arms and stood with new strength, looking into his face. His breath was coming in little breaks, and he pointed. Faintly they could make out the shadows of the corral buildings. Beyond them were no lights penetrating the gloom from the windows of the range of houses. The silence of the place was deathlike. And then something grew out of the earth almost at their feet. A hollow cry followed the movement, a cry that was ghostly and shivering and loud enough only for them to hear, and Sokwenna stood at their side. He talked swiftly. Only Alan understood. There was something unearthly and spectral in his appearance. His hair and beard were wet. His eyes shot here and there in little points of fire. He was like a gnome, weirdly uncanny as he gestured and talked in his monotone while he watched the niggerhead bottom. When he had finished, he did not wait for an answer, but turned and led the way swiftly toward the range houses. "What did he say?" asked the girl. "That he is glad we are back. He heard the shots and came to meet us." "And what else?" she persisted. "Old Sokwenna is superstitious and nervous. He said some things that you wouldn't understand. You would probably think him mad if he told you the spirits of his comrades slain in the kloof many years ago were here with him tonight, warning him of the things about to happen. Anyway, he has been cautious. No sooner were we out of sight than he hustled every woman and child in the village on their way to the mountains. Keok and Nawadlook wouldn't go. I'm glad of that, for if they were pursued and overtaken by men like Graham and Rossland—" "Death would be better," finished Mary Standish, and her hand clung more tightly to his arm. "Yes, I think so. But that cannot happen now. Out in the open they had us at a disadvantage, but we can hold Sokwenna's place until Stampede and the herdsmen come. With 2 good rifles inside, they won't dare to assault the cabin with their naked hands. The advantage is all ours now. We can shoot, but they won't risk the use of their rifles." "Why?" "Because you will be inside. Graham wants you alive, not dead. And bullets—" They had reached Sokwenna's door, and in that moment they hesitated and turned their faces back to the gloom out of which they had fled. Voices came suddenly from beyond the corrals. There was no effort at concealment. The buildings were discovered, and men called out loudly and were answered from half a dozen points out on the tundra. They could hear running feet and sharp commands. Some were cursing where they were tangled among the niggerheads, and the sound of hurrying foes came from the edge of the ravine. Alan's heart stood still. There was something terribly swift and businesslike in this gathering of their enemies. He could hear them at his cabin. Doors opened. A window fell in with a crash. Lights flared up through the gray mist. It was then, from the barricaded attic window over their heads, that Sokwenna's rifle answered. A single shot, a shriek, and then a pale stream of flame leaped out from the window as the old warrior emptied his gun. Before the last of the 5 swift shots were fired, Alan was in the cabin, barring the door behind him. Shaded candles burned on the floor, and beside them crouched Keok and Nawadlook. A glance told him what Sokwenna had done. The room was an arsenal. Guns lay there, ready to be used. Heaps of cartridges were piled near them, and the eyes of Keok and Nawadlook blazed deep and steady fires as they held shining cartridges between their fingers, ready to thrust them into the rifle chambers as fast as the guns were emptied. In the center of the room stood Mary Standish. The candles, shaded so that they would not disclose the windows, faintly illuminated her pale face and unbound hair, and revealed the horror in her eyes as she looked at Alan. He was about to speak, to assure her that there was no danger that Graham's men would fire upon the cabin, when hell broke suddenly loose out in the night. The savage roar of guns answered Sokwenna's fusillade, and a hail of bullets crashed against the log walls. 2 of them found their way through the windows like hissing serpents, and with a single movement Alan was at Mary's side and had crumpled her down on the floor beside Keok and Nawadlook. His face was white, his brain a furnace of sudden, consuming fire. "I thought they wouldn't shoot at women," he said, and his voice was terrifying in its strange hardness. "I was mistaken, and I am sure now that I understand." With his rifle he cautiously approached the window. He was no longer guessing at an elusive truth. He knew what Graham was thinking, what he was planning, what he intended to do, and the thing was appalling. Both he and Rossland knew there would be some way of sheltering Mary Standish in Sokwenna's cabin. They were accepting a desperate gamble, believing that Alan Holt would find a safe place for her, while he fought until he fell. It was the finesse of clever scheming, nothing less than murder, and he, by this combination of circumstances and plot, was the victim marked for death. The shooting had stopped, and the silence that followed it held a significance for Alan. They were giving him an allotted time in which to care for those under his protection. A trap door was in the floor of Sokwenna's cabin. It opened into a small storeroom and cellar, which in turn possessed an air vent leading to the outside, overlooking the ravine. In the candle glow Alan saw the door of this trap propped open with a stick. Sokwenna, too, was clever. Sokwenna had foreseen. Crouched under the window, he looked at the girls. Keok, with the rifle in her hand, had crept to the foot of the ladder leading up to the attic and began to climb it. She was going to Sokwenna, to load for him. Alan pointed to the open trap. "Quick, let's get into that," he cried. "It is the only safe place. You can load there and hand out the guns." Mary Standish looked at him steadily, but did not move. She was clutching a rifle in her hands, and Nawadlook did not move, but Keok climbed steadily and disappeared in the darkness above. "Go into the cellar," commanded Alan. "Good God, if you don't—" A smile lit up Mary's face. In that hour of deadly peril it was like a ray of glorious light leading the way through blackness, a smile sweet and gentle and unafraid, and slowly she crept toward Alan, dragging the rifle in one hand and holding the little pistol in the other, and from his feet she still smiled up at him through the dishevelment of her shining hair, and in the quiet little voice that thrilled him she said, "I am going to help you fight." Nawadlook came creeping after her, dragging another rifle and bearing an apron heavy with the weight of cartridges. And above, through the darkened loophole of the attic window, Sokwenna's ferret eyes had caught the movement of a shadow in the gray mist, and his rifle sent its death challenge once more to John Graham and his men. What followed struck a smile from Mary's lips, and a moaning sob rose from her breast as she watched the man she loved rise up before the open window to face the winged death that was again beating a tattoo against the log walls of the cabin. End of chapter 24. Read by Roger Moline.